know folks here must have questions for you, so let's turn it over to the floor for questions. Or we actually covered everything that anybody could possibly ask.
Do you have another book in mind?
Oh my goodness, I love that. Put some pressure on me. Yes, I've been working on another book, and actually it's another period of my life where I was a reporter at a Jewish newspaper in South Florida. And South Florida is a breeding ground for a lot of wild things. There's writers that just write about South Florida, Carl Hyacin and Dave Barry and a few others. It is a bizarre place to live. Being from New York, and there are a lot of New Yorkers there, but then there are also a lot of South Floridians there, so the culture clash is really amazing. And I got to experience that firsthand as a reporter. So that's something I've been toying with. I mean, I'll give you a little hint. As a Jewish reporter, I used to get a call regularly from the head of the local clan, commiserating, trying to make me understand he's not such a bad guy, It was odd. So I've been playing around with that, this poor broken down clan leader, calling the Jewish reporter, telling jokes, and it's like, it was strange. So yes, I'm working on something, but it's going to take a while. Remember, 15 years ago, my dad said that'd make a great story, and I said, I agree. 10 years later, I started writing. So yes.
What would you say is the most either surprising or important thing you learned about yourself through this 15-year process, through doing this project?
Well, I would answer that by saying the most enjoyable thing I learned was once you start writing and you lock into a subject that you've agreed that this is what the story is about, all these revelations come out, and that to me was rewarding. That I was able to dig into some subconscious. It's like my mind just, there was this cabinet with all these stories waiting to be opened and drawn from. And there were points where I was writing some of these stories where I felt like I was floating on air, literally, and time stood still, and it was like I wasn't even writing. You've heard musicians and other artists, painters say, I'm not even aware I'm doing it. It's almost like it's channeling from somewhere. And that was something I didn't anticipate, but it was wonderful. I'm not saying it was always like that. I mean, there were times where I was ready to throw stuff away, and I took a lot out. But
are you talking about stuff you didn't know was you had either forgotten about or not thought about in a million years?
Well, that and I'm just talking about feeling confident in what I was writing, feeling happy about what I was writing, discovering things that I had tucked away in my mind, or that I thought I remembered and then validated, So putting it on paper, making a record for it, putting it back together again, You can put it back together again if you can tap into that special place. Yes?
I'm interested in what your son thinks about it. Did he know many of these stories?
Yeah, he knows most of these stories to some extent. He's heard them all. He's told me he's heard them all. I hope someday that he reads these stories. I embarrass the hell out of him by mentioning him in some of these stories. For instance, I loved soup as a kid. My dad called me a famous soup man, which made me feel like people down the street said, hey, there goes a famous soup man. So I loved hot and sour soup, and then years later my son wrote an essay in 7th grade, and he wrote, I consider myself a gourmand of sorts, and I enjoy a nice bowl of hot and sour soup now and then. I rub that in his face all the time, and I told Mitch this the other day on the radio, and so I hope he reads this, so we'll see.
You mentioned the fact, your brothers having different memories, so I'm sure all of us have had the same experience. So, Kipp's brother, Josh, was here at Boswell and reading from his book. And there's one figure in both of your books, is Mrs. Sullivan, that it felt like two totally different people in reading your brother's book and reading your book.
Right.
Could you comment about that?
Well, I actually was going to write, I wrote a story about Mrs. Sullivan that I decided not to put in this book because Mrs. Sullivan was like a surrogate mother to me. I had two mothers. I had my mother, my biological mother, and then I had Mrs. Sullivan, who actually raised me, did the diaper changing, talked to me when I came home from school, made the food, and lived with us until I was like 15 or 16. Josh was the oldest brother. He and Mrs. Sullivan, I mean, in the book I write about how at times contentious things were between me and my older brothers. I was pugnacious, but I was also the youngest brother. And so it was good that Mrs. Sullivan was there to sort of be a go-between. So we have somewhat different memories, although he loves her. My middle brother Drew loved Mrs. Sullivan very much. I'll just leave it at that, you know.
Other questions?
Could you name any writer except your father who influenced your writing? Maybe nobody, but...
No, everybody, but that's a great question. I write in a style that's kind of, I mean, it's almost like you're a grown-up child looking back. And the one writer that comes to mind that I thought of, although I haven't really read much of his stuff, but all of you are familiar with him, is Gene Shepard, who did The Christmas Story. Mine's sort of like a Jewish New York, you know, version of The Christmas Story, but not the Hanukkah story. So there's kind of a fun, light, almost childlike view, but objective view on what was going on in my world. To me, everything was normal. I think everybody thinks their childhood is normal, but obviously I had some experiences that other people didn't, and it was fun to kind of bring that back. Gene Shepard's one of them, and probably a lot of other writers. Anyone that's a good writer is an influence, but that came to mind. And if people say it's in the spirit of kind of like a neurotic Jewish version of The Christmas Story, I would accept that.
You
Yes.
mentioned your father's writing group in New York. Is the group still, are there others around? Are they gone? Are they in communication?
Unfortunately, a lot of them, you know, are leaving the scene because of age. My dad's 84, but for about 10 or 15 years, he used to get together with Joseph Heller, Catch-22, and Mario Puzo, and occasionally Mel Brooks. And they had this little luncheon every month or so for about 10 or 15 years out in Long Island where they lived. But before that, back in the 60s and 70s, all the writers up and coming kind of knew each other. You know, it didn't matter who it was. It's actually kind of a smaller community, if you can believe that. They just knew each other, very competitive, knew whose book was doing well and whose wasn't, and would commiserate, but in the back of their minds saying, you know, not feeling so terrible about it. What is that German word for, you know?
Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude. They're very competitive. I grew up hearing my dad complain about reviewers. The funniest reviewer from the New York Times wrote a review of his book, and he said, "This is the book Bruce J. Friedman did not have to write." So you can imagine what my dad said in response to that. Everybody knew everybody. I mean, sort of like a club. And nowadays, writers, it's impossible to keep up with everybody, you know, especially if you want a blurb, you know.